Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. I've got a great conversation today with the Washington Post's David Ignatius. He has a new book out. It's called Phantom Orbit. It's all about a fictionalized view of what a future war in space involving satellites could look like. He pulls from headline-defining events like the announcement that Russians will be planning to deploy a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit in order to destroy American satellite capability, to, of course, conversations around the Space Force and the way that, in many ways, the war in Ukraine is the first true war that involves space. We cover a bunch of other topics as well, too. Of course, how the war in Ukraine is going, how the Biden re-election attempt is going, and of course, why there's a broader need for reform in America's political leadership going into this decade. Hope you all enjoy this conversation, and you can, of course, find the book in the Realignment's bookshop. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. David Ignatius, welcome to the Realignment.
Good to be with. Thank you, Marshall.
To prep for this episode, I listened to your episode with Kara Swisher on her On podcast, and you actually gave me such a great transition into articulating what the role of a fictional work plays in this broader national security space we're covering. Because I hate to do a book interview where you just sort of say, okay, so it's this fictional story, what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened, defeats the purpose. But you said specifically that you use fiction as a means of writing about concepts and ideas in this space that you can't quite just write a column about in a straightforward way. So given that framing, what is the central idea that you're covering in this book and that we could talk about here?
So the central idea is that a new era in warfare is beginning that will focus on space. The next war will begin in space. The decisive battles may be in space. There's some people who argue that the first space war has already begun in Ukraine, that fundamentally the real battle for control is in space systems and the jamming that's part of electronic warfare that's related to space and interfering with space signals, that we're already in a space war. We just don't realize it. The more I got into this in my journalism, talking with the first head of the Space Force, General J. Raymond, other people, the more I spent time in Ukraine. I've been there 4 times since the war began, looking at the technology systems that were in place that were keeping the Ukrainians alive. I just felt this was a much bigger story than I could tell in my columns, which are usually 800 words. This was immense. So as I found, this is my 12th novel, there's a way in fiction to let the world be as complicated as it really is. And let characters embody the ambiguities that are in any question. I mean, I'm miscast in some ways as an opinion columnist, because when you get to the point at the end where you're supposed to say, so you should do this, this is the right thing, this is the wrong thing. I often think, so what you need to do is think more about this, because I'm not sure yet what the answer is. And I felt that way about a lot of these issues involving space war. I'm certain that this is the future. I'm not certain exactly what we should do about it, but I felt that people just didn't really understand that we'd headed into this new era, and so thus the book.
I love that framing. So let's kind of stumble over the problem set for a second. I think what's fascinating about Ukraine from my perspective is it seems as if policymakers have to confront a couple of different quote unquote wars at once. So on the one hand, everyone and their cousin is talking about drones. I've had the CTO of Palantir on. They're talking about AI. We're also talking about fortifications and trenches and how these factors are playing all together. And then you're, of course, talking about a space war. But then we're also, I host a podcast for the Hudson Institute called Arsenal of Democracy. We're talking about how we have an inability to produce munitions in the style of, like, let's say, a World War II heyday. So I just described 4 different eras, 4 different wars. They're all happening at once. How do we engage with the future, to your point about space, while also not distracting ourselves from these very backwards-looking, present-facing challenges?
Wow, that's such a good question, good way to think about it. It is at once the most advanced war ever fought, and a war that's almost medieval in entrenchment, use of artillery, bombardment, the most close-up, grim, gritty. I mean, I've been in training with the Ukrainian military, and they leave them out in mud-filled trenches to freeze for 48 hours just to get them ready for the misery that recalls the images we have of World War I. That's part of the Ukraine war. But then I've sat with Ukrainian commanders at their computer consoles as they dial in imagery from space. You know, they'll be focused on Kherson in the south, which is a key area of conflict, and they'll say, okay, over the next 24 hours, we have contracted with our commercial providers to have 12 satellite passes. That's not enough operationally for us, so we're going to buy 8 more. And so, you know, I mean, astounding that the two could be going on at the same time. I think as we hit this frontier of warfare, a really interesting advantage that we have, that the Ukrainians in particular are using, is an entrepreneurial infrastructure. If you go to Kyiv now, you'll find young people from all over the world, Australians, Portuguese, every kind of European, and then, you know, hundreds of really smart young Ukrainians who are starting companies to build drones. Drones can be built out of anything. They're taking old furniture factories. They used to make, you know, chairs and tables, and taking the cheap wood. That's the frame for the drone. And then they're putting the most advanced electronics, and that's because the big problem is EW jamming. You need to be able to see through AI systems the terrain, even if you can't actually connect with your ground station or with GPS signals overhead. They're doing that. They're doing that with help from some American billionaire philanthropists who are flying under the radar. But it reminds me, if you've read about the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War,
Yep.
pulled idealists from all over the world who wanted to be associated with this early struggle against fascism. Kyiv has a little bit of that feeling of all these smart people who've congregated to try to help the Ukrainians, who are coming up with the most extraordinary ideas, and they're all trying to undersell each other. Somebody will say, I can't believe this drone costs $30,000. I can make this for $3,000, which is, of course, what you need to do, because a lot of them get shot down. So it's that energy that is our secret sauce, and it's also the secret sauce for the Ukrainians.
That's such a fascinating way to think about this. Okay, let's go level deeper then. So in terms of the West, it seems like a critical strength we have is this entrepreneurial, innovative ecosystem. Clearly, at this point, the Russians have demonstrated the ability of mass production. We're talking about the Chinese. We're seeing all the stats about how their commercial shipping industry is going to be able to be converted to a wartime footing and rapidly outproduce us. So if you're thinking of, okay, at a bare minimum, we have this innovation advantage. By they, I mean the Chinese, Russians, and in some contexts, the Iranians have this real scale and production advantage. How should we think about how those two sync up together?
So this war has taught me that mass does matter. That the Russian ability to just keep sending fodder into the cannon, to put the meat grinder aspect of this war matters. This war has destroyed the cream of the Ukrainian military. People say this to me over and over again while I'm there, and it's heartbreaking. But their best officers and soldiers are dead. They fought in the early battles with incredible bravery. So they're now at the second level, and they're having increasing trouble recruiting enough people to do the fight. One reason that they're so interested in drones, especially operating at the front line, is you can pull back some. You won't be under such constant artillery bombardment. I mean, if you're spending, 6 months with 24-hour-a-day shelling, you're just, and we all have seen accounts of shell shock during World War I. That's what it's been like for Ukrainians. It's horrifying. So if they can move back and operate the drones, which are incredible, tactical, and if you watch drone footage of a drone chasing something down, it's frightening. It's like a snuff movie in warfare. That's that they want to use technology in part to save lives because lives are so precious, not just in the sense that every life is precious, but they're really running out of bodies. So I think that's mass matters. The Ukrainians are struggling to deal with that. I think innovation in warfare involves the speed of warfare, but it's so easy to slow it down. As we're seeing in Ukraine. One final thing that I'd add is the Ukrainians' ability using their weapons and some weapons now from Britain to hit Russian supply points over the line inside Russia is forcing the Russians to back up some. It doesn't seem to have any effect yet in the Kharkiv fight, which is going very badly for Ukraine. But I think in general, it's going to be hard for Russia inside occupied areas, even in Crimea, to do the kind of protected planning and operations that they grew accustomed to. They're going to be vulnerable all the time. And I think that's one of the advantages that the Ukrainians have got, even in a period where they seem to be getting battered.
Here's something I'd love to have you help me understand. I'm a Ukraine aid supporter, very happy that the bill passed recently, but there just seems to be such a gap between the reality on the ground and the end game politically that Zelensky is talking about. And one of kind of my theories of why his effectiveness as a political messenger is weakened over the past year hasn't just been the obvious polarization that's happened here. It's just he sounds increasingly delusional when you describe the environment that you're describing. And he talks about how the US isn't allowing Ukraine to win, as if F-16s would make a difference in the environment you're describing, as if a army that can't defeat the Russians at Kharkiv properly yet is going to be able to take all of Crimea without escalating on the Russian side of things. So once again, I don't have a relationship with Zelensky, obviously, but I have a complicated intellectual relationship with him because I think there's a real, I think this is setting ourselves up for a political disaster when we don't identify political objectives to actual military and strategic realities on the ground.
That's really well said. From the beginning, I think Biden correctly has said that this war will and should end in a negotiated settlement. So the name of the game has been to give Ukraine enough strategic leverage that it can bargain from strength and get an acceptable negotiated settlement. I've often thought that might leave the status of some occupied territory, let's just say Crimea, undetermined for some period of time. Ukraine wouldn't obviously surrender its claim to sovereignty there, but you might say this is to be resolved by X date, and then sort of have a kind of interim status. That's often the way you end conflicts. I think the Ukrainians and Zelensky in particular step back some from their really extreme total victory, total liberation of all occupied territory views, not publicly, but I hear more talk about interest in some negotiation, understanding that they'd have to make compromises. A very interesting point to me was a statement by the Ukrainians and Chinese both, that they were interested in resuming the Chinese exploration of possible mediation and negotiation that emerged last year. The Chinese sent an emissary to Kyiv. The emissary was welcomed. I think that we're in another cycle where the Chinese are going to attempt that. I can't help but wonder if that's not a subject that came up when Putin visited Xi in China last week. But this war has to end. Every war has to end. It's not going to end with total Ukrainian victory and clearance of every Russian soldier. I think every Ukrainian knows that. What's the point at which it might end? Well, a starting point, to be honest, Marshall, is the willingness of Putin to negotiate. There's no what he wants to negotiate is Ukraine's surrender. If he gets to the point where he's actually willing to negotiate a deal that would secure some stable formula for the future, then I think the U.S. um, under any administration, under Biden and certainly under Trump, would encourage that.
Yeah, and I think what you just said is exactly why, despite my qualms with Ukrainian political strategy, I still supported the aid package, because the last thing that you'd want to do if you're seeking a settlement is convince the Russians that actually we're basically tapped out. Why would they possibly negotiate in that environment? It's the longer we're clearly committed, barring, of course, the actual political desires of the Ukrainians, the more likely you're going to see a negotiated settlement here. I want to kind of go back to the start of the conversation, though, to talk more about the themes of the book. Can you talk more about, because we covered, AI, we covered the drone war. How is Ukraine, in many ways, the first space war?
So there's several aspects of space technology that are essential for Ukraine. The first and most obvious is that Ukraine couldn't communicate with its forward frontline commanders without Elon Musk's Starlink system to provide broadband internet coverage. When Musk decided that he wanted to help Ukraine and began rushing Starlink terminals into Ukraine, his biggest problem initially was turning on the terminals. The Russians were not able to jam the signals, but just they needed a signal to say, you're on. So it's like for billing. I mean, they needed to register the user. And for a while, they couldn't do that. And they did a very creative software workaround that was able to get the terminals up and running. So Ukraine now had the ability to connect with its commanders and also to download targeting information that it was getting from very advanced systems that would use all these commercial satellites, optical satellites, synthetic aperture radar commercial satellites, thermal imaging satellites to draw a picture of the battlefield, and then they'd apply AI. The famous Project Maven that Google engineers revolted against would be applied to all the sensor data to provide an accurate picture of where the T-72 tank. This is what a T-72 tank looks like. That's its picture, and then send those coordinates to the forward lines where the artillery or the missiles were to take out the tank, or increasingly send a drone in and do it. So it was an amazingly well orchestrated suite of technologies that began, both with connectivity and the kind of raw data for that allows targeting with satellite systems. So the Russians, I wish I could say that the Russians were just that kind of sluggish, pathetic, overly bureaucratic army that we saw in the beginning of the war, which made a mess of things. But the Russians have proved in Ukraine to be a learning army. From everything that I read. There's some material that friends make available to me from Russian generals doing evaluations of what's working and what isn't, what are the challenges. And they're right on target in terms of what they need to work on. They focus on EW. They understand the satellite threat. And, interestingly, Marshall, the Russian space weapon that had Mike Turner demanding that the whole Congress be briefed back in February was a response to their recognition that commercial satellites, Elon Musk's 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit were a fundamental challenge to their ability to exercise power, were a fundamental asymmetric advantage for the U.S. So how could they take it out? And they came up with this primitive, horrifying answer. They could take it out by detonating a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit, leaving a big debris field. It's appalling but it shows first how important they think these new technologies in space are, and second, how limited their offensive capabilities right now are to take them out.
And if you think about the use of a nuclear weapon in low Earth orbit, is that a push in case of emergency? War is broken out in Eastern Europe. It's escalating beyond Ukraine style situation, because that seems like a worst case scenario. And no war, because the Russians would be affected by that too. So how should we think about the threat of a weapon like that?
So I think it's an extreme threat. I think the much more likely threat is some kind of controlled EMP, perhaps involves nuclear radiation. Radiation can fry all kinds of circuitry. And what you want to do in space, ideally, is turn off the satellites without leaving debris that makes space unusable by everybody. And if you saw, there was an article in the New York Times over the weekend that began to put some texture on what Mike Turner was warning about, what the subject of my novel is, to be honest, in terms of what is the nature of what Russia envisions. The Wall Street Journal had a piece last week. So this question of what systems will be most useful for offensive operations in space, I think, is going to converge increasingly on radiation pulses, not detonated nuclear weapons, on high-powered microwaves, which are extremely valuable in space, which have the ability to send code from a distance that could could insert malware in a system, could disable a system, to use lasers similarly to in effect turn off the circuitry, perhaps without your adversary being aware of it. So it's a new frontier in every sense, a new domain of conflict, but also new kinds of weapons, high-powered microwaves. Believe me, when I talk to people who are really familiar with this stuff, you have to talk about high-powered microwaves, their eyes become saucers. It's such a big subject.
So what I'm hearing here is that you have the technical ability to use a nuclear weapon in space, but as with nuclear weapons on the ground, it's not usable, both from an escalatory standpoint, but also from you would suffer too much consequence for it. So the key then is developing technology that you actually can use. And that's not only the focus of the novel, but I think where folks should be spending all their time thinking. Here's something I'm really curious about. So obviously everyone knows at this point a lot of the reporting on the controversies with Elon Musk and, Starlink, and now there's Starshield, and there's obviously the broader story of SpaceX. I'd like to just kind of hear from you how we should think about what happened here from a governmental perspective. You also hit on this in your interview with Kara Swisher, in that, if it's the 2000s, NASA, the DoD, et cetera, really was caught napping when it came to Elon's initial focus on rapidly reducing the cost of launch, providing an alternative to the space shuttle, and then obviously as an ancillary but incredibly valuable service that comes out of that launch ability, you even have Starlink be available in the first place. So that I can really object, as I do, to a lot of the ways that Elon, I think, over considers himself a strategic thinker and a geopolitical person, but he does have this ability because the government slept, and that's how our system works. How should the government think of its role relative to the privatization of space moving forward? Because it's not as if it's this, first Cold War where literally only the government can do it. You can't have a privatized space industry. So how should we think of the ecosystem and who has what role, what actually is in the government's purview? How should they be entrepreneurial, et cetera?
So this goes to one of the questions that interests me the most. I think our entrepreneurial system and the fruits of it, and Elon Musk is a perfect example, as objectionable as his management of Twitter may be. What he did with SpaceX and Starlink is just dazzling, beyond to Tesla even. He's an incredible engineer, thinking about physical units, physical production. So, I think entrepreneurs like him give the United States an advantage that China and Russia simply can't match. I mean, it's pretty clear that authoritarian societies choke off their entrepreneurs. Look at what China did to Jack Ma. Look at what Russia did to its most aggressive, creative oligarchs. The worry that I have is that the public-private partnerships that develop between the Pentagon, our intelligence agencies, and these amazing companies arguably are at the whim of the entrepreneur. I mean, what happens when Elon Musk decides this war in Ukraine is going on forever? I have business to do in China. I need to make Teslas there. I need to sell Teslas there. That's my business future. my stockholders require me to act responsibly. John Bailing, sorry, President Zelensky, but find another provider. And although there are limits on that, there's a way in which we're going to be subject to the political and foreign policy agenda of our best entrepreneurs. I mean, the biggest companies, I think, act wisely and responsibly. I'm amazed at Microsoft, for example. I mean, he could have been wiped out in terms of its networks if Microsoft had not detected in the 48 hours before Russia launched the invasion that malware attacks were coming and alerted the Ukrainians and helped them get their key data to servers that were protected off and outside Ukraine. It was Microsoft's ability to see that on networks and its decision as a company, we're not going to allow that kind of attack. It's really, really great. So, but that doesn't, I mean, every company isn't going to be run by Brad Smith or Satya Nadella. They're going to have different kinds of people, and Musk.
And quick to denote this, you just listed non-founder run companies, which is the key differentiation. And obviously Glenn Shotwell is at SpaceX, but the founder-led nature, and this is also the Henry Ford problem during the pre-World War II era when he was very unsupportive of Britain's initial efforts. So there's just like a dynamic between established tech companies on their third or fourth generation of leadership versus founder-led companies very tied into their image and priorities.
So I think that's true. Although a publicly traded company like a Microsoft will feel complex shareholder responsibilities and may be risk averse. There's another issue to think about. It's not just the whims of the founder, but Google had a core of engineers that rebelled at the idea that Google and its engineering talent would be used on Project Maven to analyze data sets and make algorithms that essentially allowed targeting. And they said this is not an appropriate thing for our company or for us as engineers. You can understand that, but the company in the end decided, no, this is important, and we feel the responsibility to do it. And I think that was the right decision. Amazon historically has felt under Jeff Bezos, now under Andy Jassy, that its government businesses, including with the intelligence community, are central to what it does. And I think Amazon would say to its engineers, this is what our company does. If you're not comfortable with it, you're a talented engineer. There are other companies you may want to work at, but this is what we do. And they have stockholders and a board that clearly supports that. But there are all these interesting pitfalls. The idea of public-private partnership sounds so great, but it does introduce a set of issues, again, that have received relatively little study. We don't really, how do we manage in that world? How does the Pentagon manage its accounts efficiently?
Yeah, especially when it'd be one thing if we were literally in a war, but we're in this ambiguous, this sort of like the national security impetus that I think would, as during World War II, resolved a bunch of those questions. Henry Ford. We're in this more ambiguous period. I think you said, quote, that we kind of think of war as like an on or off switch, but actually it's a dial. So if this is towards it's not a 2, it's not a 1, it's not a 0 in terms of 1 to 10, but it's not quite at the 8 to 9 or 10, where I think it'd just be very easy to say, no, national security imperatives, we're cutting through the awkward parts of this relationship. I want to take this to the other side of the globe, but also kind of speak to the awkwardness here. You spend some time in the book talking about previous Taiwan crises. Obviously, going into the 2024 election and into 2025, there's a lot of questions about China policy. I think the interesting thing about this broader Trump era is that if there's one area where there's just been a pretty strong through line between both administrations, it's been China policy. Unclear what would happen to the Democratic Party if Joe Biden lost re-election. I've talked to a bunch of folks in Biden hawk world, and they're privately sort of skeptical that the rest of the party apparatus has truly come to even understand, but agree with this sort of hawkish trade direction. But curious, how do you think about China policy in the context of 2024 and beyond?
So I think you're right. First of all, to say that there is an unusual bipartisan consensus on China. Um, Given that, when everything's moving in the same direction, I always worry that we're going to talk ourselves into preparations for conflict that make conflict more likely, not less. It's a fine line between having the systems that can deter an adversary and making an adversary feel so surrounded and cornered that the war becomes more likely. I'm not somebody who thinks that war with China is inevitable, certainly not desirable. I mean, a full-scale war with China would be catastrophic for the United States and China both. It's the classic example of the war that would leave everyone worse off, and is, if it can be avoided, should be. So part of avoiding it is making sure we're matching China, that they don't think that they could easily attack us. I think ambiguity about what we do about Taiwan continues to be the correct policy. There are a lot of people who'd like to firm that up into a kind of war plan that was sort of all fixed in place. It sounds a little bit like pre-World War I planning about mobilization, which is why Europe got locked into that catastrophe. So I don't want to see that. I want to see ambiguity and the exercise of judgment. I do worry with the U.S. and China that because they're so advanced technologically, um, and the Chinese are working on hypersonic weapons to shorten decision times, that increasingly decisions will be made by AI systems, which will see and anticipate actions by the other side and make, sort of predictive, preventive decisions that shorten the rungs in the escalatory cycle and make war more likely and worse. This Before Henry Kissinger died, interestingly, this became his obsession.
Hmm.
Henry Kissinger spent much of his career thinking about arms control. Obviously, negotiated the beginnings of the arms control agreements with Russia. He, as a strategist before he ever came into government, was a wizard of Armageddon, thinking about the kind of language of thermonuclear war. At the end of his life, and I had several interviews with him about this, with Eric Schmidt's guidance. Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, he became a student, this tottering old man in his 90s, of AI. And he was convinced that it wasn't the weapons themselves, the nuclear weapons, that were the issue anymore. It was the systems that would drive them. And I remember Kissinger talking, and he wrote in a couple of books that, just as DeepMind in chess and AlphaGo in Go devised strategies for chess and Go that no human being had ever devised or could ever devise, when those systems are applied to warfare, they'll devise strategies for conflict and destruction of the adversary that no human, in other words, they'll be diabolical. And Kissinger wanted to have some dialogue and some limits. And I'm happy to say, in a world where there are many bleak developments, Kissinger's hope that we have a China-U.S. AI dialogue has actually been realized. It's something Jake Sullivan has worked especially hard on. There's one thing that the public isn't generally aware of that deserves to be celebrated. It's more. It's the fact that Jake, with Kissinger egging him on from the beginning, has now got this going, and they've had at least one round, I think.
Something I'm fascinated to hear from you then, given what you just said, escalation, spooking the Chinese in a way that makes conflict more likely, over planning in a way that sets you on a very direct path. That's to be avoided. My perspective on this is really driven by the need to deter conflict and the need to be prepared should the worst come. So I'd like to kind of go through like the differentiation between because it's very easy for me to kind of politician things that are deterrence minded into actually leading to escalation. So I would place Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan in the category of spooking relative to any like direct benefit. But on the other hand, I would say things like hardening American supply chains vis-a-vis China, especially with critical materials and minerals, friendshoring, and then frankly, doing some serious work to like reboot the broad like arsenal of democracy from a munitions and production perspective is kind of ambiguous because on the one hand, like you're mobilizing, you're preparing for something. There's a way that you could sort of say like, hey, that's going to spark them to mobilize and prepare. But how would you think about differentiating between preparation and resiliency to provocation and danger?
So I'd make exactly the same point that you did about Pelosi's visit. I think Pelosi's visit did more damage to Taiwan than almost any recent event, in that it pushed the Chinese to redraw the lines so that the kind of line that they would approach offshore, was extended after Pelosi's visit. I think it's a significant and interesting failure by Biden that although he and his advisors knew this was a mistake, he couldn't find a way to tell her no. I've written that that's Biden's biggest weakness. He doesn't know how to say no, whether it's to Nancy Pelosi or his son Hunter or to, a prospective vice presidential candidate. He's just not good at saying no. So I think that was an example of provocation that ended up making our friends worse off in the act supposedly of loving them. In a category of things that we should do beyond building weapons capabilities, survivable forces, don't have a bunch of aircraft carriers sitting ducks out there ready to be targeted by China. I would put high on my list something that the current Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell is focused on, which is thinking about ways to buffer our bilateral confrontation with China with our great allies. We're just incredibly lucky that in Asia we have these fabulous allies, starting with Japan and South Korea, but then these sort of rims of great allies all the way down to Australia. And they're valuable as allies in a potential conflict, but also in buffering conflict. So it's not just this sort of, dyad, destined for war. There are all these stoppers along the way. And I think this administration very wisely gave our relations with Japan and then Japan building a little triangle, the U.S., South Korea, and the United States. Another little triangle, Japan, the Philippines, the United States. And, those triangles, there's a triangle that involves India that's much more fragile. But I think those ideas are part of good security policy, in part because they reduce the chance that, you're just these two superpowers kind of going closer and closer and closer. There's going to be a crack up.
Speaking of Biden, as you also discussed with Kara, once again, I like that interview, so I'll keep referencing it. You were one of the first read in the White House types to put forth the idea that Biden should consider not running for re-election. I'm sort of torn on that topic because on the one hand, there's all the obvious cases against Joe Biden, but the counter that anyone in the Biden world could offer is, okay, who then? Kamala Harris polls worse. I also think, though, on a side note, this is a problem that they created on their own because they clearly should have prepared a stable of folks who could have run. Additionally, I think the thing that's so wild about reading about the FDR era, just because I'm doing a lot of work with my Arsenal of Democracy work, is just like the real stable of talent. So not just like elected officials, not just senators, but just Harry Hopkins, folks within the New Deal. There were just so many people. I don't think this would have been a situation that FDR would have found himself in. So it's sort of frustrating. They basically say, who else is supposed to run? It's like, I don't know. You guys had 4 years to prepare for this eventuality, and they genuinely did not do it. But how do you assess their ability to make the judgment call on the no one else can do it? We're confident the polls aren't right. How do you think about that?
So when I wrote the article that got the White House so upset and attracted a lot of attention, I guess because I had generally been supportive of Biden, saying that basically he was too old to run and that his vice president had not gotten traction with the country and they needed to think about a different alignment. there was a week when everybody got, held their breath and wondered whether there'd be a lot of defections. I mean, nobody in Washington last summer wasn't talking about this.
Hmm.
But it was universally said, but publicly unspoken. And here was this stink bomb detonated by yours truly. So um, there was a moment when I think people were wondering whether to push it further, and the White House. Just Biden, I think, was furious, and his wife was even more so. And it really became a loyalty test. Don't go there. Don't
Hmm.
begin this discussion. And the reason that Biden offered to his friends is I'm the person who stopped Donald Trump. I stopped him in 2020. I stopped him in the 2022 midterms when all of you people said we were going to get blown out, and we weren't because I did a good job and we had achievements and people liked basically what we were doing. And I'm the only person who can beat him this year, and that's why I'm doing it. It's not because I'm being an old politician. It's because I think I can win, and I don't know anybody else who can. So that's what he decided. I did want him to take a moment where he had to think it through and make a decision. Um, you know, it is true that there's not enough obvious, visible talent in the Democratic Party that you can easily think of alternatives. I mean, Democrats really need to fix that in the future. That there needs to be a stable of people where you'd say those would be great leaders. Those would be, how wonderful, how lucky we are to have people of this quality who want to run for office. But we don't feel that now. I mean, as when you look at the polls, who knows whether polls are accurate or not? But I find it terrifying that Trump is ahead in all the swing states. If you look at the polls right now, you have to reckon on Donald Trump being elected president this November and living with the consequences of that for our country and the world. That's pretty scary to me.
The way you articulated that raises another question, which is if I'm thinking about the flaw in the way I think the Democratic Party, and then frankly, like the non-Trump part of the Republican Party approaches leadership and next generation transitions, is it's so narrative focused. It's like Gretchen Whitmer, she's a woman and she's in Michigan. That's a swing state. And I know Gavin Newsom's Gavin Newsom, but it's California. That has to mean something. It's the progressive future of the country. It's not individually based. It's not about specific leadership qualities or like actual realities or performances of individual candidates. Once again, this is a bipartisan issue. Like I'll go there, like Tim Scott. Come on, like that's a demographic narrative. It's not like if you poll anyone, most of my friends work in the Senate. No one would say, you know what, Tim Scott was really the next generation person who wanted to elevate there. So how should we think about the fact that because this generational transition is happening no matter what, how should we rethink how we approach actually evaluating and producing leaders who are up to the challenges that you're writing about every week?
So I think people like me need to cast our net more widely, look more for talent around the country. Not necessarily congressional leadership here in Washington, but out in the states. My feeling is about great leaders is that you know them when you see them. I remember, as I think anybody, certainly my age can, when Barack Obama gave his speech at the 2004 convention, and it was electrifying. I mean, you could just feel the force field of American politics shift with that speech. It was brilliant. It was beautifully delivered. And then, we move on with just incredible speed. In some ways, it would have been good for Obama to have had more of a political education before he became president. But it was like just 4 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, we know great leadership when we see it. The rise of Bill Clinton, same way. I mean, Clinton, whatever you'd say about him, was a political genius. I I don't cover politics primarily, but one of my things on my to-do list is go out and try, listen more for who has great ideas, what's catching fire, what's different from what you think it is. There was a very good article in the New York Times over the weekend by David Leonhardt, who
Yeah.
said maybe we're actually living in the bipartisan era. We just haven't recognized it. Here's what may distinguish this era and what we agree on. I thought that was really just it had the force of an idea that is was obvious once it's expressed, but you hadn't really thought of it that way before. Who are the politicians who are expressing that? That you might not have noticed. So it's a kind of long-winded way of saying let's go see, let's find out who they are.
Yeah, and it also doesn't need to descend into sort of a let's go to a diner and talk to 2016 voters in a cliche way. No, I think that's really so. Here's what I'm also curious about. So I'm fascinated to your point, like you cover foreign policy and you're thinking a lot about like American domestic politics. I'm someone who covers foreign policy, but also just like really covers American domestic politics via my non-think tank work. And I'm trying as hard as I can to get all of my ambitious young political friends who got into elected offices there in the state legislatures to actually focus more on foreign policy. Because if we're looking at everything from the CHIPS Act, like, why do we even need to do this in the first place? Oh, it's because there's this broader geopolitical competition that stems out of like COVID and a real reassessment of globalization. So I just love to hear from you. Usually it's sort of, hey, come understand this country better. What should the people in the States who you're kind of saying, hopefully they're out there who are on the radar, what should they learn about what you are doing? Because like, I'm trying to get them to like think more hardly about this, but they're just not because the incentive structure just isn't there. So I'd love to, you're speaking to them directly here. So I'd love to kind of hear your take on that.
So I think every creative governor or mayor understands the reality that we live in a global economy, that you need to be competitive in producing products that the world wants and inviting investment from the world. I mean, they know they're connected. I think one of the things that the country really is agreeing on now is that we shouldn't be vulnerable in the way that we were during COVID to foreign supply chains, unreliable suppliers, a dangerous, sometimes hostile world, that we need to do more manufacturing here. I think there's general agreement that the radical inequalities in income have left the United States weaker and more vulnerable to internal strife, that we're just diverging from being the kind of country that we want. I think that's widely shared. I think there's an appropriate wariness of some kinds of foreign entanglement at the same time that, thank goodness, people realize we have an obligation of honor and values to Ukraine. So the people who were out, close up in retail politics at the state and local level, I'm glad you're trying to reach them. I used to be a trustee of the German Marshall Fund, and one of the things that we worked hardest to do was to get ourselves out of Washington around the country and introduce a new generation that doesn't know about the transatlantic alliance, all these kind of wonderful, glorious ideas of the post-1945 world may have very little meaning if you're a mayor in Atlanta. So we tried to reach out and make people feel they were part of this web of interconnection. And I think once that happens, a wonderful example to me of somebody who does it just right, and I'd love to see have more of a future in national politics, is Gina Raimondo. She was
This is
governor.
off the record. No, I'm not saying who this is, but I was just at a dinner in DC where someone just said the same thing. There's a mini boomlet. Folks who have heard of this person before, so that's funny.
If you polled Washington dinner parties, she'd be overwhelmingly the candidate. But so I want to mention her because she was a Rhode Island governor and had to deal with the very tough problems of a big deindustrializing. Rhode Island's a little bit of a Rust Belt state. she had to take on her unions, especially the teachers union, other public service unions, and get deals that the state could afford. She made a lot of enemies, but she was tough. She's tough, tough, tough. She was extremely competent as a business person, and has been very good as a deal maker. And then as a cabinet secretary, she's done one of the most interesting things that the government's done in years in the Chips Act. There were a lot of other people who were involved, but she was basically steering the ship, and it's a big deal. So, there's an example of somebody who came out of state politics, who isn't all that well known, Italian American woman, so there are a lot of Gina Raimondos out there, and Gina Raimondo has a big future, but she's not a unique case.
It's fascinating. Even that example gets at, this podcast is called The Realignment, and talk about a realignment. Commerce Secretary was not a position that could be seen as the jumping to the top of the DC dinner party crowd in terms of energy and appeal there. And it's just like, given the nature of the post-COVID moment, there were just a lot of opportunities there. I'll tell you this, like in terms of like the 20-something, early 30-something crowd, I'm most blown away by the folks who are in commerce right now, in terms of like the staffers, the people who will be hearing about 10, 15 years from now. Just like a real serious smattering of like great people there. So I want to give that quick shout out. So here's the last big question. On that episode I keep referencing, you talked a lot about Theodore Roosevelt as a person who really appeals to you as a leader. I just did the president of the Roosevelt Library Foundation just came on the podcast, so I've been thinking about him a lot. And I think what's interesting about Theodore Roosevelt is it's not as if he came into Congress or came into the presidency with like all this legislation, and it's not as if like he like did that much in like the modern FDR sense of here's this big program and here are these big bills he's passing. He really was just able to be a leader. Like he's able to negotiate the coal strike. He's able to mediate the end of the Russo-Japanese War. He was once again a leader. That's what we were kind of like talking about here. I'd be curious how you kind of think about like his example as one that folks should be thinking about when it comes to not just sort of having like, no one just said like, look at Theodore Roosevelt. He's from New York. He's lived out in the West. He's like, they're the narrative aspects of his reality were really there, but you didn't just have to rest on them. You didn't just say Gina Raimondo, she's a woman. She's still pretty young. Like we need that in the party. You said specifically, here are these things she's done to demonstrate she can actually lead effectively. So just kind of close on Theodore Roosevelt and talk about that example, because I think it's really a telling one.
So I got interested in Roosevelt again recently after reading a study by the Rand Corporation of how nations decline. And this was commissioned by the Pentagon. One of the points they made was once nations enter a period of decline, it's very rare that they can stop it. They tend to decline more and more, like the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburgs. So a rare counterexample is the United States in the post-Gilded Age period. The United States was booming, it was expanding its frontiers, but it was sort of eating itself from the inside out. It was rotting in terms of political governance, very corrupt. Income inequality was growing. The plutocrats of big business were just sometimes out of control. And an antidote was needed, or something bad was going to happen to the United States. And that antidote was the progressive movement led by Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican. And, he said, as reformers have in a few other contexts, we need to fix this. This great country of ours is in trouble. And so we need to start to clean it up. So the reform movement, Roosevelt really began in state politics in New York, which was super corrupt, had machines and, it's just dirty money everywhere. And he began to stop it. And then he came to Washington with that same idea. Let's clean this up. The trust busters, the idea that giant corporations shouldn't make all the decisions about how we work and live. The beginnings of the labor movement were in that period. It was a period where people recognized what was dangerous to the health of the country and actually worked together to fix it. There was a civic elite, cross parties, but people who were thoughtful, well educated, wherever they were, but whatever party they were from, all kind of came together to say, well, our country, we need to protect this country because it's got some problems. So that's where I think we want to be. We're talking about David Leonhardt's article saying maybe we have something like that. We just haven't recognized it. But Roosevelt's a wonderful figure because he was authentically American in every way. He was an iconoclast. And he had the guts to take on. I mean, he just he didn't stop. If he felt something was right, he did it. And you can argue he's one of the people who really saved the country from what might have been a spiral of we would still have been super powerful, but we would have been a very different country.
David, that is an excellent and optimistic place to end. Thank you for joining me on the Realignment. The book is Phantom Orbit.
Thank you.